Gwendolyn Brooks, Illinois' own poet laureate for many years, once said that Langston Hughes was the most important poet of the 20th century. But when you combine Langston Hughes with Vachel Lindsay, you think to yourself, that's an odd pairing. Not really. Over 100 years ago, it was really rare, not just in this country, but anywhere in the world, for a white male poet to help a poet who is non-white. And that's really striking. These two poetry artists have very contrasting styles, but equally passionate about their own work and the messages they wanted to send the world.
Listen to one, listen to all, for rhymes and far millennial themes. Sit on a mountain top alone, under the sky winds flurry and fan, remembering still the groans of man.
By 1925, Vachel Lindsay was one of the most famous poets or performance artists in the United States. People would have known who he was. They would have recognized him when they saw him. His photograph would have appeared in newspapers and things like that.
Hughes and Vachel Lindsay met for the first time late in 1925 under very peculiar circumstances.
Lindsay was scheduled for a reading of his work
at the Woodman Park Hotel in Washington, a good hotel, as they say.
He had gone into the restaurant, sit down to have a meal, and one of the people who was working at the restaurant, in this case, is working as a busboy, is Langston Hughes.
Hughes said that he went in at some point to do his job as busboy and noticed Vachel Lindsay, who was very well known as a poet at that time.
Vachel had not met Hughes before. He wasn't terribly familiar probably with his work, but Hughes certainly recognizes Vachel Lindsay across the room, and he sees that there's an opportunity for himself.
And he began to think, perhaps I should try to get to him and get him interested in my poetry.
He walks across the room, approaches Vachel Lindsay, hands him some copies of his work, and mentions the fact that he is also a writer and a poet.
While Hughes looked on from afar, from a corner of the restaurant, he saw Vachel Lindsay beginning to go through the poems, and he thought, well, that was the end of it. But in fact, it wasn't the end of it. It turned out to be the biggest boost he received as a poet and a lover of verse.
That evening, he read that poetry that he received in front of a large audience as part of his own performance, of course, crediting Hughes and announcing that these poems were written by him, and announcing that Hughes was a great poet and complimenting his work, but that he was working in the hotel restaurant. And that fascinated a lot of people. Hughes, I think, was a little surprised when he arrived at work the next day to find reporters waiting there to speak to him.
A photographer came and they asked Hughes to hoist a tray, dishes on it, and she was happy to do. The story of the busboy poet began to spread, and that picture went across the United States to many places, carrying the name of Langston Hughes for the first time. And Hughes thanked Lindsay. He made sure to thank Lindsay for his generosity, for recognizing that there was some quality in his poetry, and being prepared to bring that quality and those poems to the world. For Hughes, it was a major step forward. The following month, his first volume of poetry appeared, The Very Blues, and he was on his way, tentatively, as a published poet.
One of the early letters that comes from Vachel Lindsay to Langston Hughes offers him some words of advice, not so much in terms of his writing, but in terms of how to deal with the fame, and how Vachel makes some suggestions of how to avoid people who may be looking to exploit him as an artist, especially as somebody who's new to the field. Langston Hughes did acknowledge that it was a great thing that to have somebody like Vachel Lindsay recognize his work and see him as an artist and promote his work. He wrote to Lindsay to thank him for doing that. He even later on, when Hughes starts to correspond with Vachel Lindsay's sister, he mentions that the Lindsay family, becomes good friends and allies for him as he tries to navigate this world of being a professional writer.
Vachel Lindsay had come out of a wealthy family. His father was a very successful and prominent doctor, and then the son took to the streets, as it were, writing his poems and selling his poems in order to live, a vagabond poet, if you like. So he saw that, and it's not something that he could have done on his own deliberately, because the risk was greater to him than it was to Vachel Lindsay. But he saw the example of Lindsay making that connection, having faith in the common people, and I think it lit a fire under Hughes, and going great distances to read to audiences, in particular audiences of Black Americans, taking his poetry to them, to entertain them, to instruct them, just to breathe his, as it were, his vision of life and society and art to as many people as he could. I don't know if Hughes was aware of Lindsay's failing health and increasingly desperate financial situation, but I do know that he was really crushed in a way by the news of Lindsay's death. Here was this very, very prominent American poet, one of certainly the top dozen American poets in terms of national reputation, the embodiment of American ideals.
Through his correspondence with Vachel, that Langston Hughes was introduced to Vachel's older sister, Olive Lindsay Wakefield. Olive had been a missionary for the early part of her life. She believed very strongly in the concept of loving your neighbor as yourself, accepting other people.
She was totally opposed to the onslaught on Langston Hughes by leading journals, accusations against him that he was a communist. So he was drawn to her remarkable personality and distinguished intellectual and spiritual standing, and they struck up a friendship, which they maintained mainly by correspondence.
Of course, a written correspondence at a pretty challenging time for Langston Hughes. Hughes is, at that time, very well known, is traveling across the country in the late 1940s to speak and read some of his writing. And when he's traveling through central Illinois, it happens to be just after Olive has returned to Springfield, moved back into the Lindsay family home. And so she tells Langston Hughes that when he's coming through this area, he should stop by the house, he should join her for dinner, and then he was welcome to stay overnight here as well. And so he takes her up on that offer.
And it was a respite from what Hughes endured in restaurants, in hotels, certainly, during these terrible days of segregation.
Because he is well known not only for his writings about African American culture, but for his ability to lead discussions that help bring people of different races together. There was a group of more than 10 organizations in Springfield that all came together in 1948 to invite Hughes to give a speech here in Springfield. Unfortunately, there were a number of other organizations, again, not just here in Springfield, but across the country, who felt that Langston Hughes was only going to come here to spread ideas about communism. And of course, this is during the Cold War. And so they write letters to newspapers, they create campaigns against him, and that performance actually had to be canceled due to those things that were written and threats from opposing organizations. Olive was disappointed that had happened, as were other members of the Vachel Lindsay Association. They were one of the sponsoring organizations, along with Springfield Urban League and YWCA and a number of other groups. What they found in doing this was that their goal of having this performance, having this appearance by Langston Hughes, was to bring people together. And there were other groups that wanted to exploit the situation to tear people apart.
I don't know if Hughes needed it, but he certainly was strengthened and emboldened, as it were, by Vachel Lindsay himself. To write the poems he wanted to write, to reach the audience he wanted to reach, to engage the population on issues that were crucially important to him. And I think one would have to say that he is in many ways not quite a disciple of Vachel Lindsay, but somebody who was set on his way by Lindsay.
Now, of course, we know that Lindsay really gave a hand up to Hughes in helping him get published and get known as a poet in a way that he didn't have to do. So we thought it might be fun and educational and illustrative for you to hear 3 of their poems done back to back. The first 2 are by Hughes. The first is Harlem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, one of the most famous lines in 20th century poetry. A short poem, but a powerful poem with a deep message. And the second Hughes poem you will hear is called English for Theme B, a conversation between an African-American girl, student, and her white male teacher. And the issues raised in that conversation will really resonate with you and do in race relations around the world today. The third poem is by Vachel Lindsay, and Lindsay was enraptured by nature. And Sweetheart Spring is a poem that celebrates nature. And the 3 performers will do it in a round, and so you will hear their voices weaving in and out from each other, restating and repeating the images of nature that Lindsay was enraptured with. And when you hear the contrast between those 3 poems, you will be struck by the power and style of these poets, and knowing that they were linked more than 100 years ago and really supported each other in becoming the artists that they became.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load.
Or does it explode?
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 The instructor said,
Go home and write a page tonight, and let that page come out of you. Then it will be true.
I wonder if it's that simple. I'm 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem. I went to school there, then Durham, then here, to this college on the hill above Harlem. I'm the only colored student in my class. The steps from the hill lead down into Harlem, through a park, then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page.
It's not easy to know what is true for you.
Or me, at 22, my age, but I guess I'm what I feel I see in here. Harlem, I hear you, hear me, we two, you, me, talk on this page. I hear New York too, who, me? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, or records, Bessie Bop or Bop. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So, will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white.
But it will be part of you.
Instructor, you are white, yet you're part of me, as I'm a part of you. That's American. Sometimes, perhaps, you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you.
But we are, and...
That's true. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, although you're older.
And white.
And somewhat more free. This is my page for English B.
Our sweetheart spring
Our
came
sweetheart
softly.
spring came softly.
Her
Gliding hands were
Her
fire.
lilac breath
Her lilac breath upon our
consumed
cheeks consumed us with
By
desire.
her our God
By
began
her
to
our
build.
God began to build,
Began
to sow until
He laid foundations.
He laid foundations in our love.
For every good and
foundations
ill.
in our
Every
loves.
good and
We
ill.
ask him not for
good and
We
blessing.
ask Him not for blessing.
We ask him not
him
for
not
We
for
ask Him not for pain.
We asked him not for pain.
Still, to the just and unjust, He sent His fire and rain